I've been here 21 years now. You don't get a direct no. It took a long time for me to understand what is no in Japan.
Even for you, after 21 years in Japan, you still might have difficulties to understand if whether the person is saying no or yes. Because in Japan, whether it's business or the private life, you almost never hear clear no. Instead, you will probably hear that like, well, we will consider it, or it might be a bit difficult, but let me come back to you later, or we need to check internally, something like that. But depending on the situation, those often means no. What really matters isn't the words themselves, but it's everything around them.
Hello and welcome back to Asia AIM, the podcast that shines a light on the people, ideas and innovation shaping business, marketing and communications in Japan and across the APAC region. I'm your host, Robert Heldt. Today we're talking about something a lot of global teams learn the hard way. Japan doesn't just buy differently, it decides differently. And if you're building a brand here, especially through partners, culture isn't just a detail. It's the whole playing field. I'm really happy to have a true expert with us, Sayuri Namiki, who's the President and Representative Director of Pelikan Japan K.K. Sayuri started her career in sales after graduating from a university in the US, joining a leading American furniture manufacturer. She then moved to a UK-based financial newspaper where she worked with hotels, airline clients on value-driven solutions to strengthen brand positioning and grew into a management role. After that, she returned to the furniture industry as country manager and B2B strategy manager to lead business growth and drive strategy. Today, she's leading Pelikan Japan's business focused on sustainable growth and building brand value grounded in Pelikan's heritage and craftsmanship. Sayuri, it's so great to have you on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Robert. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me here today.
So you've lived at the intersection of brand, design, and commercial growth. How does that combination change the way you think about strategy, especially in Japan?
Well, for me in Japan, brand, design, and growth are never separate things. They really work as a one system. In many markets, the thinking is very simple. First, you push for growth. How do we sell more? How do we scale? And then the brand and design comes in later to support that. But in Japan, the order just doesn't hold. Here, the growth that isn't aligned with the brand and the design might look successful in the short term, but almost always it slows down at some point. And the reason is quite simple, because Japanese customer and business partners as well, they are constantly asking very quietly but very seriously, who is this brand and why does it exist? And even if the number looks good, if people don't feel a clear philosophy of consistency and the sense of intention behind the brand, it doesn't last. And this is even more true today because especially with the Gen Z, the market is clearly shifting away from the pure product consumption towards to the story-based consumption and even empathy-based consumption. So in about 10 years, around 70% of Japan's purchasing power will come from millennials, Gen Z, and even the Gen Alpha. And honestly, 10 years go very fast, just like this.
That's
so
true.
If business doesn't start shaping their strategy to resonate with those generations, it's going to be very hard to success. So when I think about the strategy in Japan, I always look four things together. First, is this growth actually strengthening the personality of the brand? And second, It's the design translating the brand's philosophy, not just decorating the products. And third, does the brand have the story that people can genuinely relate to? And finally, last but not least, if we look back in 5 years from now, is this a story that we will be proud of? So those are the 4 things that I think of.
Okay. So when you then just put Japan side by side with, for example, North America or Europe, what are the cultural differences that actually change, sales and marketing? Not theory, but in real deals. What do you see?
Okay. Actually, there are 3 things. The first one is the focus on decision preparation, not the decision speed. This is very unique in Japan. People often say in the West, decisions are made in meetings, but in Japan, they are made before the meeting. And that is true. But in the real business, it goes even deeper than that. Because in Japan, what really determines is the outcome isn't decision itself. It's how many people have aligned before the decision is finalized. From the frontline staff to middle management, all the way up to the final decision makers. There are multiple layers of buy-in. If that alignment hasn't happened, the deal simply doesn't move. The second difference is that the presence of unspoken evaluation criteria. Things like reliability, sincerity, and a long-term commitment carry a huge weight in Japan, even though I know that they are very hard to turn into KPI, but it matters here. And the careful follow-ups and the consistency and the strong service mindset often becomes the real decision factors. And interestingly, if you rely too much on logic and efficiency, it can actually hurt the trust. So being logically correct, it doesn't always mean that being credible in Japan. So the third difference is how failure is judged. In many Western markets, failure is a frame of the learning. But in Japan, what matters much more is how you behave after the failure. Do you take the responsibility? Do you explain clearly? And do you improve and stay engaged? This engagement is very, very important here. So the process often determines whether the relationship survives. So showing sincerity really matters here.
Yeah, especially I think for me, the failure bit resonates a lot. Do you take responsibility? How you adapt to the failure, right? It's not just, you failed and then you go do something else and try again.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's really fascinating. So if you were to, look at, one global playbook habit that you've seen working with a lot of global brands that fail in Japan, and why does it fail? What would that one global playbook be?
Well, the idea is that speed is always a virtue. In Japan, being fast is far less important than being careful and inclusive. When speed comes at the cost of explanation or the stakeholder alignment, it almost always backfires. So you might feel like you're moving forward quickly, but very often you'll be pulled back later. So in Japan, speed only works after trust is established. Without the trust, speed becomes a risk, not an advantage. Because so at first you may feel the frustrating because from the Western point of view or from the global teams, the things doesn't move so quickly in Japan. But once you build up the relationship, business actually becomes surprisingly smooth.
Right, absolutely, yeah, and I think you've really summarized that very well. Focus on building the trust, because a lot of the speed that happens after the trust is built is because a lot of the decisions are being made silently, and alignment is happening silently, although you don't know what's happening behind the scenes. So very well
Exactly.
said. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And in Japan, no, I've been here 21 years now. You don't get a direct no. It took a long time for me to understand what is no in Japan. So what does no sound like in real life, and how can non-Japanese, foreigners like myself, learn to understand, what I'm hearing when they're saying no?
Yeah, even for you after 21 years in Japan, you still might have difficulties understand if whether the person is saying no or yes. Because in Japan, whether it's business or the private life, you almost never hear clear no. Instead, you will probably hear that like, well, we will consider it, or it might be a bit difficult, but let me come back to you later, or we need to check internally, something like that. But depending on the situation, those often means no. What really matters isn't the words themselves, but it's everything around them. So how long does it take to get the response from the person or the company, or what's the tone of the email or the tone of the voice? And most importantly, does the other side suggest it a clear next step? If someone says, well, we will consider it, but there is no proposal for the next meeting, very often the decision has already been made. Another thing that I see quite often is this. In the meeting led by overseas team, the reaction feels very positive. Everyone's applied in the meeting and you feel that they are engaged and they are smiling. And Japanese are very smiling on their face. But later, when Japanese colleagues follows up after the meeting without the foreigners, suddenly a lot of detailed questions appears. That doesn't mean that there was no interest. It actually is the opposite. In Japanese communication, people often avoid disagreeing on the spot out of the respect for the other person. So sometimes you were being told no with smile, preciously because you were being respected.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Very interesting. Yeah, so I totally relate to that, been in many of these situations myself. So walk our listeners through how is communication, seen and practiced in Japan, whether through meetings, silence, follow-ups, what's being said between the lines. What do outsiders consistently kind of misread when it comes to communication in practice?
One of the biggest misunderstanding is the silence, because in Japan, the silence doesn't mean that the disagreement, and most of the times it means people are thinking or choosing not to speak yet. But outsiders often misunderstand two things. First, no objection in a meeting doesn't mean agreement. Second, a smile doesn't always mean positivity. People often say quiet to preserve harmony. But the real message usually shows up later in the follow-up emails or in what actually happens next. Actually, there is a book from the Erin Meyer that title names the culture map. This is interesting, so let me introduce a little bit. The idea behind it is if you understand whether you own the culture and your counterpartners and culture fit relative to each other, so you can prevent misunderstanding and dramatically improve the team performance. So one of the culture map that Japan categorized as a very high context communication, meaning a lot of understood without being said, indirect feedbacks, and a strong respect for the hierarchy. So if you are in the meeting, basically you respect the person, your client. So you normally says no in front of the person and being very polite to respect the person.
Very fascinating, yeah. We talked a little bit about trust earlier, right? So if you're an outsider, you're a new brand, new team, you're entering a new market, what can you do to move trust in Japan quickly, and what do you do, to get instantaneous trust? Is it even possible? And what can destroy trust very quickly if you do, things that are not the right way or say the right thing?
Okay. Well, first of all, never rush to gain trust.
Hmm.
So, what accelerates the trust is consistency, as I said, between what you say, what you do, and how you make decisions. So, keeping small promises matters much more than making the big claims. So, what destroys trust the fastest is the change without the explanation, such like price change, the policy change, or the strategy change, the shift change, any changes, those are made without said, or the explanation comes after. The real problem is not the explaining, the those changes. Actually, those changes are not the problem. The real problem is not explaining why that happens. So in Japan, sincerity builds the trust far more than the perfection even could.
Okay. So yes, what I'm hearing is then, change happens. Change is part of, business process. Change is part of sales cycles, whatnot. Communicate that change with sincerity, and try not to hide it, right? Or try not to say, just price change because price has to change. But explain what the change is, explain the reasons. That really helps. Very good
Exactly. And
advice.
before the
Yeah.
change.
Okay. And so if you have to describe the Japanese consumer mindset in one sentence, what would it be? What do people get wrong when they try to simplify it?
Well, Japanese consumers care deeply about whether their choice is responsible, not just for themselves, but in the relation to others. So they think beyond price or specs. They ask, is this something that I can stand behind? And can I live with this choice for long term?
Okay. So it's about that, thinking beyond just a personal choice. That's fascinating. In premium categories in Japan, like value is beyond price, as you just said. Like, what's the value behind the decision? So, what does value really mean here? How does culture shape value?
Yes, as you said, in Japan, the value goes far beyond the price and specs. And its core, it really comes down to the three things. The first, it has to have the story you can explain. Not a marketing slogan, it's a real story. Where it comes from, why it was made, and what kind of thinking sit behind it. Japanese consumers care about whether they can understand the background and whether the story feels honest. And the second, it needs to be something you can use for a long time, not use and leave and change to something next. Longevity is extremely important here. That doesn't just mean the durability. It also means that the design doesn't get tired, the quality holds up, and the brand is still there years later. In Japan, the premium product is often judged by how it aged and not how impressive it to look to the other people. And the third, it has to be something you'd feel comfortable recommending to someone else. This is very big one because people in Japan are very conscious of how their choices reflect on them socially. So before buying, they often ask themselves, would I feel confident introducing this to a friend, a colleague or family or your colleagues? So if the answer is no, it doesn't feel like the real value. So no matter how good the spec is. And that's why specs are really just the entry point. And they get attention, but they don't choose the decision. They don't close the decision. And yes, and in the end, the value in Japan is almost whether people can respect the brand attitude, how it behaves, how it treats customers, and whether its philosophy feels consistent over the time. So the premium in Japan isn't about the being expensive. It's about being honesty and being emotional and being touched and being related.
Yeah, and I think what happens quite often is global brands, especially that have very rich heritage, right? Over the years they've built the heritage in their home country, so they should, and they're very proud of that heritage. That heritage, you should bring it and communicate that through natural storytelling. Quite often we see brands come and just try to translate the story without thinking about how do Japanese consumers want to hear the story in their voice, in their language, so that often we try and recommend to brands to focus on storytelling, creating the original story, not just translating your history to suit the Japanese audience. Yeah. What's the one misconception about Japanese consumers that you would like to change?
Okay. And that Japanese are conservative. Because in the reality, once Japanese consumers are convinced, they become incredibly loyal. Such like a Pelikan customers. We are the foreign brands that last for 185 years, but the customer continues to buy our fountain pen. So once they commit, they are very loyal. So Japanese don't dislike changes. They dislike careless changes. A good example is how new brands, like the new brands who wants to come to Japan market to start their business, are adopted here. When something new enters to the Japan market, the reaction often feels slow. I think you've also had the same experience when you started the business here. The people take time, they observe, they wait, and from the outside, that looks conservative. But what's really happening is that the consumers are checking consistency. Is the quality stable? Does the brand behave the same way over the time? Does it take responsibility when something goes wrong? Once those questions are answered, something interesting happens. People don't just buy once, but they commit. So you see this very clearly with long-established brand that successfully evolved. And when a brand updates the design or the positioning while clearly respecting its core value, Japanese consumers follows, and they say something to us, and they say sometimes for decades. On the other hand, when brand suddenly changes direction, new message like new design, the new pricing, without clear reason of explanation, trust breaks very quickly.
Yeah, I think, as you pointed out, like, you spend a lot of effort building the trust, right? So it's very easy to lose that trust quickly. If you don't communicate, it's not that change is not important. It's about how you communicate that change with honesty and sincerity, like you mentioned before. But that's well and good once you've got the customer, right? So, but even before you get a consumer customer, just stepping one step back, how do Japanese consumers decide where are they looking for reassurance? Do they go to reviews, communities? Do they speak with friends? Do they look at the brand heritage? What carries the most weight today when Japanese consumers are deciding on a product or a brand?
Or the store, if you go to the store, they buy from the store, the store staff explanation and also the brand heritage, they do research, and the real user experience is still matters a lot. But nowadays, they go to the online and look at the review. That also matters, but the real recommendation from the someone you trust carries a much more weight.
Okay. And so what are their expectations around, aftercare, after service, accountability, as I know, is very important in Japan, like you just explained. So what does taking responsibility look like here compared to, for example, other markets?
Well, the taking responsibility in Japan means that the staying engaged until the issue is fully resolved. It's less about reforms and but it's more about showing commitment to improvement and the continuity. It's something like I've just said, how you overcome the failure, the follow-ups and the engagement, the continuous engagement. Those after service models here.
Okay. So kind of switching into, you worked in B2B and B2B2C currently, right? So who's like the hidden customer in Japan? Who are the key decision makers or influencers, and how do you go about winning those customers?
Well, for the B2B2C market in Japan, the hidden customer is almost always the people on the ground. They are not the ones signing the contract for like a B2B, not on the middleman, but they are not all the person. They are sitting in the boardroom. They are the hidden customers are the store staff, the sales associates, and the customer support teams, and the people who actually have to deal with the product every day after the launch. So in a B2B2C business model, the contract might say we are listed or we are rolled out nationwide. But whether the product actually sells depend on those frontline people. So in Japan, especially if the people on the ground don't believe the product itself, they don't have the passion or the love for the products, they won't actively recommend it. So they won't explain it with the confidence. And very often, they won't openly complain either. That's the problem. So, but they just doesn't move. So how do you win them? It's not just about product training. Of course, specs matters, but they are not enough. You need to give them the context. Why does the product exist? Why is it priced this way? And what problem does it genuinely solve for the customer? And just as importantly, what happens when something goes wrong? If there's a complaint or the return or the difficult customer, does the brand stand behind the frontline staff? And are they left alone to deal with it? So this is the thing.
I can see that. And I think also, as you mentioned, like, if they're not passionate about the brand, they don't sell it. On the flip side, if they're passionate about the brand and they love the brand, they're your best brand ambassadors, right? Because now, they're recommending the product and sales start to take off, and they feel more pride and representing the brand because they're working for something that's prominent and has customers that are interested in it. So you can actually definitely tap on frontline staff to be your best brand ambassadors. Yeah. Speaking of brand and brand storytelling, again, Japan, is a unique market. Everything's in Japanese. Even in business, everything is in Japanese, right? How do you localize brand and brand storytelling for Japan without creating a Japan-only kind of brand? Because working with global brands, you need to maintain global consistency, but then you need to also communicate and win the hearts and minds of the Japanese consumers and buyers?
Yeah, well, this is a really important question, and it's where many global brands struggle, I think. The key is this: you don't change the core message, you change the interpretation. So, the common mistake is trying to create a completely separate Japan version of the brand, such like a new slogan, new positioning, new storytelling. Over the time, that weakness the brand because no one can see the core anymore. They cannot relate to the headquarter message. The brands that do well in Japan keeps the same global DNA, but they shift the angle a little bit. or shift the angle to the right direction. For example, the brand that talks about innovation and self-expression in the US. In Japan, the same brand might emphasize craftsmanship, continuity, and care of the user. The message isn't different. It's being taught through the different cultural lens. So I often describe it as an interpretation, not the translation. The translator converts the word, but interpreter converts the meaning. And this is where the local team becomes critical. If your Japan team is only allowed to translate materials, you will miss the nuance. But if they are the trust to interpret the brand within the local context, then you can stay globally consistent while still feeling genuinely local.
You touched on a very good point. I think it's that, global teams need to trust their local counterparts in Japan to interpret it for the market through their own voice and through their own, storytelling angle. Because like you said, we do a lot of transcreation. We work with a lot of global brands. Like this is the biggest challenge we see day in, day out in our work. And it's not about translation. I think you put it very beautifully. It's about interpreting what the meaning is, what the story is for the local audience. Yeah. So, what is shifting in Japanese buying culture at the moment that global marketers should be aware of and be prepared to handle?
Well, one of the biggest shift, especially among the younger consumers, is that the people are paying less attention to what they buy and much more attention to who they buy from. So the price still matters, of course, but the attitude matters more. So the young consumers in Japan, like Gen Z, they are asking questions like, does this company feel honest? Do they behave consistently? And how do they act when there's a problem? So they also less impressed by the fame. Being well known doesn't automatically mean that being trusted anymore. And interestingly, this shift isn't just driven by the social media trends, but it's driven by the strong desire not to regret their choices. People don't want to feel foolish for buying something that they flashy but that disappears a year later. They want the brand they can stand behind.
Yeah.
That means that the short-term campaigns or the loud messages might still create the spikes, but they don't create the stability. What creates the stability is the consistency and the clear value and the visible accountability, The shift is already showing up in the numbers, but the brand that feels careless sees certain drops-offs, and the brands that feels steady grows slowly, but sustainability.
Yeah, that's, really well said. And I think I'm seeing this theme of consistency, trust, building accountability, showing up and doing the right thing. So what would be your, top 3 advice for foreign brands that are looking to enter Japan in the first 90 days? What should they do, to be successful culturally and, of course, commercially as well?
Okay, for first 90 days, well, the first thing I would say, spend serious time for listening. And I don't mean just making the research or the reports. I mean the listening to people. Talk to distributors, talk to store staff, talk to the customer support team, and ask not only why isn't this selling? Don't rush on numbers, but how does this feel to the customer, the end user who uses it, who will be our loyal? In Japan, the emotional reactions often explain more than the logical ones. The second move is to make a very small promises and keep them. This is where many foreign brands struggle. They come in with the big vision and ambitious timelines. But in Japan, trust is built through the follow-through. So if you say you will deliver something small by a certain date and you do it, that matters. Do that for the few times, and suddenly conversation becomes much easier. The third move is to treat the Japan team as a decision maker. Not just the translators. So cultural discomfort shows up in various stubborn ways in Japan. If local teams don't have the authority to adjust and clarify or to push back, problems won't surface until it's too late. That's our culture. And when Japan teams are empowered to say, this doesn't feel right here, then the brand avoids the expensive mistakes. So the first 90 days aren't about the speed. It's about the setting the tone of the trust, and the tone of the determines everything that follows.
Yeah, and then empowering your local team to make the right call. You've hired a great team, so trust them to be your voice of reason on the ground, right? So very, very good advice. Thank you, Sayuri. So yeah, it's been a really fascinating conversation. I'd like to wrap it up with a round of quick fire questions for you. Is that okay?
Yes, please.
So in one word, what describes winning trust in Japan for you?
Consistency.
Consistency. Yes, that's what we've been consistently talking about this morning. So really, really true. And what's the best advice you've received about cross-cultural leadership?
Have the courage not to rush.
Okay, so be patient and consistent and patient. And what's the one habit or ritual that keeps you a sharp leader these days?
Well, always ask questions and stay curious.
Okay.
Stay curious to everything.
Yeah. And do you have a closing thought that you can share with us?
Well, the cross-culture understanding is not a matter of the etiquette. That's what I believe. And I've been living in the US, and I've been dealing with the foreign companies for a long time. And there are always a cultural difference, not the Western or Asian or Japan, but within the Europe, there are also the cultural differences. And understanding that it's not an etiquette, but it's a business skill, and with the right framework of mindset, it's absolutely learnable.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Sayuri. This was a masterclass, about, how to sell in Japan, the nuance of culture, the best advice for go-to-market strategy. So really appreciate your time on this podcast.
Thank you very much for having me here. It was quite fun.
Thank you. Thank you very much for listening or watching Asia AIM podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please do subscribe wherever you get your podcast. And I'd also love for you to leave us a review. Review makes a huge difference in how people discover our show. Until next time, I'm Robert Heldt, and I'll be back soon with more conversations on how to win in Asia's dynamic and diverse markets. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Asia AIM podcast. If today's conversation sparked new ideas or insight, be sure to subscribe, rate, and share the show. For more resources, tips on doing business in Asia, or to book a meeting with our team, visit asiaimpodcast.com. Stay curious, stay connected, and we'll see you in the next episode of Asia AIM.